Welcome to Void of Fears. I've been checking my analytics, and I noticed that 46.5% of you watching right now aren't subscribed yet. We're on the journey to 10k subscribers, and your support would mean everything. If you're enjoying the content, hitting that subscribe button takes just a second and doesn't cost a thing. You can always change your mind later, but your subscription helps this channel grow more than you know. While you're at it, drop a like on this video to help it reach more people who might enjoy facing their fears with us. Now, let's dive into today's story. Dr. Samuel Harlow stared at the government issue phone in his hand long after the call had ended. 3 years of isolation in his coastal cottage laboratory had made him unaccustomed to unexpected communications, especially ones that contained words like classified, unprecedented, and redemption. The memories of his last expedition haunted him daily. The Challenger Deep, research mission that had cost James and Olivia their lives. Equipment failure, they'd said officially. Poor judgment, they'd whispered unofficially. His reputation had collapsed as quickly as the experimental deep-sea habitat he'd designed. No university would touch him now. No research vessel would have him aboard. Yet, here was the US Navy practically begging for his expertise. The anomaly they described defied conventional understanding. A gravitational disturbance 36,000 feet below the ocean's surface in the Mariana Trench. Satellite data showed what appeared to be a growing void. A place where sonar simply disappeared. They needed someone with his specialized knowledge of deep-sea phenomena. Someone who understood pressure systems at crushing depths. Someone desperate enough to risk everything again. 1 week later, Harlow found himself aboard the USS Oceanic, a research vessel disguised as a standard naval cruiser. The team assembled around the briefing table was impressive, even to his jaded perspective. "Dr. Naomi Vance," said the sharp-featured woman with silver-streaked hair, tied back in a severe bun. She offered her hand. "Astrophysics, specializing in space-time anomalies. I've read your papers on deep-sea pressure systems. Brilliant work, despite recent setbacks." Captain Elias Mercer didn't offer his hand. The Navy SEAL stood with his arms crossed, eyes constantly scanning the room, body language suggesting he considered this assignment beneath him. Security detail was all he offered by way of introduction. Dr. Linsau was different, enthusiastic, her eyes bright with scientific curiosity. "Marine biology," she explained, spreading out a tablet showing deep-sea creatures. "I've been mapping evolutionary adaptations to extreme environments for a decade. Whatever's down there, I want to understand how it affects the ecosystem." Mark Russo was the last to arrive, sauntering in with the confidence of a man who had cheated death dozens of times. His weathered face broke into an easy smile. "I'll be your driver for this suicide mission," he announced, dropping into a chair. 15 years piloting deep-sea submersibles. If it can go down, I can drive it. Admiral Phillips, their mission commander, dimmed the lights and activated the holographic display. "What I'm about to show you is classified at the highest levels," he began, bringing up three-dimensional renderings of the ocean floor. 6 months ago, our deep-sea monitoring stations detected an anomaly. At first, we thought it was equipment failure. The display zoomed into the deepest part of the Mariana Trench, revealing a pulsating area where data simply didn't exist. "It's growing," Phillips continued. "Whatever it is, it's expanding approximately 3 centimeters per day. Local sea life has completely abandoned the area. Water temperature around the anomaly fluctuates wildly. And most concerning," he paused, looking at each of them in turn, "gravitational readings suggest matter is disappearing into it." Dr. Vance leaned forward. "You're describing a potential singularity. That's impossible at these depths." "6 months ago, I would have agreed with you," Phillips replied grimly. "Your mission is to investigate and report back. Nothing more." The briefing concluded with technical specifications for their vessel, the D.S.V Abyss. a revolutionary deep-sea vehicle capable of withstanding pressures no human had ever survived. Its reinforced hull contained state-of-the-art laboratories, living quarters for 5, and an observation deck with transparent aluminum viewports. As they toured the submersible later that day, Harlow ran his hand along the sleek control panels, feeling both dread and exhilaration. This vessel was a masterpiece of engineering, exactly the kind of craft he had dreamed of designing before his career imploded. "Having second thoughts?" Russo asked, sliding into the pilot's chair and familiarizing himself with the controls. "I never stopped having first thoughts," Harlow replied. "But we're here now." That night, unable to sleep in his temporary quarters aboard the Oceanic, Harlow stood on the deck watching moonlight play across the Pacific. Tomorrow they would descend into the abyss, chasing whatever impossible phenomenon waited below. He wondered if, like Challenger Deep, this would be another one-way journey. Behind him, Dr. Sow approached quietly. "Beautiful night," she observed. "Perhaps our last under familiar stars," Harlow responded, not entirely joking. She smiled. "You know what they say, we know less about our ocean depths than about the surface of Mars. Whatever's down there, we'll be the first to see it." "That's what worries me," Harlow said quietly. "Some things should perhaps remain unseen." The launch was smooth, the abyss slipping beneath the waves with barely a ripple, its powerful exterior lights illuminating the gradual transition from sun-dappled surface waters to the deeper twilight zone. Inside, the 5-person crew monitored their systems as Russo guided them downward with practiced precision. "Passing 1,000 meters, he announced. "All systems nominal." In the main cabin, Dr. Sow was already documenting the marine life outside their viewports. Lanternfish pulsing with bioluminescence, gelatinous creatures with translucent bodies. "The mesopelagic zone is particularly active today," she noted, recording everything on the ship's computers. Unusual migration patterns. Captain Mercer remained vigilant at his security station, eyes constantly scanning both external cameras and internal monitors. "Keep the science commentary to essentials," he ordered. "Channel discipline." Dr. Vance rolled her eyes at his military rigidity, but focused on her specialized equipment. Gravitational sensors, quantum field monitors, and other devices Harlow couldn't even identify. As they descended, past 3,000 meters, entering the midnight zone where sunlight never reached, Harlow felt the first twinge of uneasiness. He'd been at these depths before, but something felt different. The darkness outside seemed more absolute, the water more viscous against the hull. "Anyone else notice the temperature fluctuations?" he asked, pointing to the environmental readouts. The external temperature was oscillating by several degrees, impossible at these depths where conditions remained constant. "Probably sensor interference," Mercer suggested. "These depths play havoc with electronics." But by 5,000 meters, they couldn't dismiss the anomalies so easily. The communications link to the surface began deteriorating, coming through in broken fragments rather than clear transmissions. The lights flickered intermittently, and most disturbing, strange sounds emanated through the hull, low-frequency vibrations that seemed almost rhythmic. "That's not normal pressure effects," Russo said, his usual confidence wavering slightly. "I've never heard anything like that at any depth." Dr. Vance frowned at her instruments. "Our descent rate is increasing. We should be dropping at 4 meters per minute, but we're currently at 7, 8, 10 meters per minute." "Engine output hasn't changed," Russo confirmed, checking his controls. "Something's pulling us down." At 8,000 meters, they passed a milestone, deeper than Mount Everest is tall. The crushing pressure outside would instantly compact any unprotected human body. Their spotlights penetrated only a few meters into the inky blackness. "Wait!" Dr. Sow suddenly pressed against the viewport. "Cut exterior lights." Russo complied. plunging them into darkness. After their eyes adjusted, they saw it. Faint bioluminescent trails in the water, moving in coherent patterns, unlike any known deep-sea creature. "They're leading somewhere," Harlow observed, "following a path." When they restored lights, the trails vanished, but they kept the submersible on the same trajectory. By 10,000 meters, communications with the surface had failed completely. The abyss was designed with this possibility in mind. They would continue the mission and resurface to report their findings, but none of them had anticipated the increasing sense of wrongness that permeated the vessel. Shadows moved across viewports when nothing was visible in their lights. Instruments recorded phantom temperature drops, plummeting briefly to near absolute zero before returning to normal. The hull creaked, not with pressure but with sounds reminiscent of whispers. At 11,000 meters, the designated maximum depth of the Mariana Trench, they should have been approaching the bottom. Instead, their sonar showed nothing below, an impossible empty void where the seafloor should be. "We're falling faster than physics should allow," Dr. Vance announced, her voice tense. 20 meters per minute now. Engine compensation isn't making any difference." And then they saw it. Their lights illuminated what appeared at first to be a massive underwater storm. A swirling vortex of water embedded in the ocean floor, pulsating with ethereal blue light. The circumference was enormous, at least 50 meters across, and the center appeared bottomless. "That's impossible," whispered Dr. Tsao. "Water doesn't behave that way." "Turn us around," ordered Captain Mercer immediately. "Full reverse thrust." Russo's hands flew across the controls. "No response. We're caught in its current." The gravitational sensors went haywire, needles spinning wildly before the displays cracked. Outside, the blue glow intensified, seemingly reaching towards the vessel with tendril-like projections of light. "It's a wormhole," Dr. Vance breathed, half in terror, half in scientific awe. "A stable Einstein-Rosen bridge underwater. It shouldn't exist." Her words were cut short as the abyss was yanked violently downward. They were pulled into a spiral, the hull groaning under forces it was never designed to withstand. Equipment tore loose from moorings, crashing around the cabin. Warning klaxons blared momentarily before the electrical systems failed. Harlow felt himself lifted from his seat despite the restraints, his body seeming to elongate as fundamental forces went haywire. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the terror on his teammates' faces as they too experienced the impossible, their bodies stretching, compressing, existing in multiple places simultaneously as space-time itself distorted around them. Then darkness, complete and absolute. Harlow awakened to the gentle rocking of the abyss. For a moment he thought they had somehow returned to the surface, that the entire incident had been a hallucination brought on by pressure sickness. Then he opened his eyes to see his 4 teammates in various stages of recovery, and the reality of their situation came flooding back. "Systems rebooting," Russo announced from the pilot's chair, his fingers dancing across touchscreens as they flickered back to life. "Hull integrity holding, life support functional." Dr. Vance was the first to look outside the viewports. "We're underwater, but shallow." Indeed, light filtered down from above. Actual sunlight, not the artificial glow of their exterior lamps. According to their depth gauge, they floated just 30 meters below the surface. "I'm taking us up," Russo decided, not waiting for consensus. "Whatever happened, we need to establish our position." No one argued. The abyss rose steadily, breaking the surface minutes later with a gentle splash. They crowded around the viewports, expecting to see the USS Oceanic waiting for them. Instead, they saw open ocean stretching to the horizon. No ship, no land, just endless blue water under a cloudless sky. But something was wrong with that sky. "The sun," Dr. Tsao whispered. "It's setting." "It's morning," Captain Mercer countered, checking his watch. 700 hours. That's not the point, she replied shakily. Look at where it's setting. The west should be that way based on our compass. That's east. The implications hung heavy in the air. They activated the exterior cameras and scanned the horizon in all directions. After a full rotation, they spotted something in the distance. Massive structures rising from the water, too geometric to be natural, too large to be human-made. They resembled enormous obelisks, their surfaces covered in what appeared to be glowing vegetation. Those aren't on any map, Harlow stated the obvious. Night fell with unnatural quickness, and they found themselves under a starry sky. But not their sky. The constellations were wrong, familiar stars, grouped in impossible configurations. Dr. Vance spent hours taking measurements, checking and rechecking her calculations, before finally addressing the team. Based on stellar positioning, atmospheric composition, and gravitational constants, we're on Earth, she announced. But not our Earth. The fundamental physics are slightly altered. Gravity is approximately 1.2 times stronger. The atmospheric oxygen content is 3% higher. And there are radiation signatures I can't identify permeating everything. You're saying we went through a wormhole to... What? A parallel Earth? Captain Mercer asked incredulously. A variant Earth, she corrected. Similar enough to support familiar life, different enough to have taken another evolutionary path. Russo brought up the navigation systems. I've identified land masses. The continental structure is recognizable but altered. There's an island chain near our position that corresponds roughly to where Guam would be in our world. We need to make landfall, Harlow decided. Assess the environment, search for signs of civilization or technology that might help us understand what happened. Captain Mercer objected. Protocol dictates we should remain with the vessel. Protocol assumes we're still in our own reality, Harlow countered. We need information, and we won't get it floating here. The island loomed before them as Russo guided the abyss towards a sheltered cove. From a distance, it resembled a tropical paradise. Lush vegetation, white beaches, gently sloping hills. But as they approached, the differences became apparent. The trees were wrong. Their trunks pulsed subtly, expanding and contracting like breathing lungs. The leaves shifted colours, not with seasons, but seemingly in response to the abyss's approach, from deep green to brilliant purple. They anchored offshore and prepared the auxiliary craft, a small launch designed for coastal exploration. Captain Mercer insisted on full environmental suits despite atmospheric readings suggesting breathable air. We don't know what microorganisms exist here, he argued, and no one disagreed. The five of them crowded into the launch. As they approached the shore, ripples spread across the water, not from their vessel but emanating from deeper waters, as if something massive moved beneath them. Just ocean currents, Russo assured them, not sounding convinced. They beached the launch on golden sand that sparkled with flecks of blue mineral, unknown to Earth geology. The air, when they finally tested it, was breathable, but heavy, carrying scents that were almost familiar but fundamentally alien, like smelling a rose that had notes of copper and ozone. Dr. Sao collected samples of everything: water, sand, plant matter, storing them in sealed containers for analysis. The shoreline vegetation crept visibly backward as they approached, plants actually uprooting and moving away. Sentient flora, she murmured in amazement, responding to perceived threats. They observed wildlife that at first glance resembled Earth creatures, birds soaring overhead, small reptiles skittering among rocks, but closer inspection revealed disturbing differences. The birds had too many wings, arranged in geometric patterns. The reptiles' scales shifted and rearranged themselves like living armor. Most unsettling were the sounds. Familiar ocean waves and rustling vegetation were underscored by a constant low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. And the birds didn't call, they whispered, producing sounds uncomfortably similar to human speech just below the threshold of comprehension. "We should move inland," Harlow suggested, pointing to higher ground. "Establish a better vantage point." They followed a natural path through the underbrush, each step revealing new biological impossibilities. Flowers that tracked their movement, fungi that emitted soft light in their footprints, trees whose bark rippled like water when brushed against. Captain Mercer stopped suddenly, raising a hand for silence. He pointed to the ground where the soft soil revealed distinct impressions. Footprints. Human footprints. Recent, he assessed, kneeling to examine them. 5 distinct individuals, based on stride pattern and depth. Heading that direction. He pointed inland. The team exchanged glances, the same question in everyone's eyes. Who or what walked on human legs in this impossible place? They followed the tracks cautiously, weapons and scientific instruments equally ready. The path led them deeper into the island's interior, climbing gradually until they reached a ridge overlooking a small valley. Dr. Vance gasped audibly. Below them stood a facility, a building of unmistakably human design, all sharp angles and industrial materials amid the organic chaos of the surrounding environment. Most shocking was the faded emblem still visible on its exterior wall, the insignia of the United States Navy. "That's not possible," Captain Mercer whispered. "We don't have installations in the Mariana region except for Guam itself." Yet, there it stood. A research facility bearing their employer's mark, looking as though it had been abandoned for decades. Vegetation had reclaimed much of the exterior, but unlike the living plants they'd encountered thus far, these growths appeared dead or dormant, their colours muted, their movements stilled. "We need to investigate," Harlow decided, already moving down the slope. As they approached the building, the wrongness intensified. The facility was simultaneously too new and too old, its architecture suggesting technology beyond current capabilities, yet degraded, as if exposed to harsh elements for half a century. The main entrance stood partially open, its heavy security door hanging from a single hinge. Captain Mercer took point, sweeping the darkness beyond with his tactical light. "Movement Protocol Alpha," he ordered. "I lead, Dr. Harlow behind me, Doctors Vance and Sow in the middle, Russo covering our rear. 5-meter spacing, no one touches anything without clearance." The interior was a study in decay. Advanced equipment reduced to rust and debris. Furniture collapsed into unrecognizable heaps. Papers and records disintegrated into pulp. Emergency lighting still functioned in places, casting sickly yellow illumination across scenes of apparent evacuation. Personal effects laid abandoned. Meals remained half-eaten on tables long mummified by time. Dr. Sow examined a laboratory section. "These are tissue samples," she observed, studying partially intact specimens in preservation fluid. "Marine life, but engineered somehow, genetically modified beyond anything we could currently achieve." Captain Mercer discovered a weapons cache, advanced firearms with unfamiliar designs. "These aren't Navy issue," he noted. "Not any military I recognize." Dr. Vance found herself drawn to what appeared to be the main research area. Massive screens covered the walls, most shattered but a few still intact. Star charts displayed constellations, matching the alien sky above them. Complex equipment surrounded what looked like a containment chamber in the center of the room, a heavily reinforced glass cylinder large enough to hold a person. But it was the Dr. Harlow who made the most disturbing discovery. In what appeared to be the facility's security center, he found a storage unit for video files, its backup power still functioning. The most recent entry was dated 1 week in the future. "That's impossible," he muttered before accessing the file. The screen flickered to life, showing security camera footage of the facility's main entrance. 5 figures entered cautiously, wearing environmental suits identical to their own. As they removed their helmets, Harlow felt ice form in his veins. The team on the screen was them. Himself, Mercer, Vance, Tsao, and Russo exploring the facility exactly as they were doing now. He called the others, and together they watched in horrified silence as their doppelgangers moved through the same rooms, made the same discoveries, eventually gathered in the same security center to access the same video files. The footage continued, showing events they hadn't yet experienced. Their team setting up a base camp within the facility, beginning to research the phenomenon that brought them there, discovering something in the containment chamber. Then, the final recording, dated 3 days in the future, their duplicates gathered in the main lab, arguing about something. Suddenly they all turned towards something off-camera, expressions transforming from disagreement to pure terror. One by one, they were dragged away by something invisible, their screams cut short as they disappeared from frame. The footage ended with a static shot of the empty laboratory, a dark liquid pooling on the floor. "We need to leave," Captain Mercer stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Now." They moved quickly toward the exit, no longer concerned with scientific discovery, only escape. But as they reached the main corridor, Dr. Vance realized something. "Where's Russo?" The pilot had been behind them moments ago, bringing up the rear as ordered. Now he was simply gone. No sound, no struggle, no warning. Captain Mercer attempted radio contact, but only static answered. "We stick together," he ordered. "No separating under any..." A burst of garbled sound from their radios interrupted him, resolving briefly into Russo's voice. "Guys, by the water. I don't think we're alone." The transmission ended, with a strangled sound that might have been a scream. "He must have gone back outside," Dr. Tsao suggested. "Maybe he saw something." "Or something saw him," Harlow added grimly. They exited the facility, weapons drawn, calling Russo's name. No response came except for the alien whispers of the wildlife and the omnipresent humming that seemed stronger now, vibrating through their bodies. They followed the signal from Russo's tracking beacon, heading back towards the shore where they'd landed. The sun, this world's sun, was setting again, casting long shadows through the moving vegetation. They found him standing at the water's edge, perfectly still, his back to them, staring out at the ocean. Relief flooded through them until they got closer and saw his face. His eyes were wide, unblinking, pupils dilated to near-perfect circles. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, and he wasn't breathing. "Mark?" Dr. Tsao approached cautiously, reaching for his arm. Captain Mercer pulled her back. "Look," he whispered, pointing toward the water. Something was emerging from the ocean, not rising so much as constructing itself, pulling matter from the water to build a form that towered over them. It began as a vaguely humanoid shape, but as more of it emerged, any resemblance to humanity distorted, its proportions stretched and compressed randomly, its surface constantly flowing like liquid mercury but somehow maintaining cohesion. Most terrifying was its face, or rather faces. The features on its head-like appendage cycled rapidly through different visages, some human, some not. Among them, unmistakably, were their own faces, perfect replicas that lingered longer than the others, staring down with expressions of curious hunger. And then it spoke. Not with one voice, but with hundreds layered into a cacophony that somehow remained comprehensible. Among them, they recognized their own voices. "You were never supposed to come back." Russo's body suddenly jerked like a marionette. His head turned 180 degrees to face them, neck bones audibly cracking. When he spoke, it wasn't his voice, but a perfect imitation of Dr. Harlow's. "The cycle is broken now. The loop cannot be maintained." Something liquid and dark oozed from Russo's eyes, nose, and mouth. The same substance they'd seen pooling in the final security footage. His body collapsed, and the creature from the water extended a tendril-like appendage, dragging him into the waves with impossible speed. They ran. No discussion, no scientific curiosity, just pure survival instinct driving them back toward the launch. But the island had changed during their exploration. The path they'd followed inland was gone. Vegetation grown impossibly dense in the space of hours. "The monoliths!" gasped Dr. Vance as they fought through the underbrush. "Look!" The massive structures they'd observed from the water were moving, rotating slowly on their axes. As they watched in horror, the monuments began uprooting themselves from the ocean floor, revealing that what they'd taken for pedestals were actually limbs. The glowing vegetation covering them pulsed in synchronized patterns, like neurons firing across a massive network. "They're alive," breathed Dr. Sao. "The whole ecosystem is a single organism." The ground beneath their feet trembled, then softened like melting wax. Captain Mercer was the first to sink, the earth swallowing him to his knees before he could leap clear. "Run!" he ordered, firing his weapon into the liquefying ground. "Get to the abyss. That's an order." Dr. Vance and Dr. Sao hesitated, but Harlow grabbed them. "He's right. We can't help him if we're all trapped." They raced toward the shore as Mercer disappeared beneath the surface, his last act to throw his weapon to Harlow. Behind them, the entire island seemed to be rising, revealing itself as yet another massive living entity. They reached the launch and pushed off from the rapidly disappearing beach, the small craft's motor straining as they sped towards the abyss. Behind them, the water churned and boiled as massive shapes converged. The monolithic beings, the island creature, and countless smaller forms, all flowing together into something beyond comprehension. "The wormhole," Dr. Vance shouted over the chaos. "It's not a natural phenomenon. They created it. They're farming realities." "What are you talking about?" Harlow demanded, as they reached the abyss and scrambled aboard. "The facility, the duplicate teams, they're harvesting alternate timelines, bringing versions of us through to study, to consume. We're not the first team to come here. We're just the latest iteration." Inside the submersible, they initiated emergency launch procedures. Dr. Tao wept silently for their lost teammates as Harlow took over piloting duties. "The vortex brought us here," he reasoned. "It can take us back." "If it still exists," Dr. Vance cautioned, "and if we can find it again." The abyss submerged just as a massive wave threatened to capsize it, the backwash from the converging entities. Their sonar immediately detected the underwater topography had completely changed. Where there had been a gradual slope to deep water, there was now a sheer drop-off, a perfect circle descending into blackness. "That's it," Dr. Vance confirmed. "The wormhole repositioned itself." Harlow engaged maximum thrust, pointing them downward into the abyss. Behind them, massive shapes followed, the creatures in pursuit. "They're not letting us leave," Dr. Sao observed, watching the sonar contacts closing rapidly. "They don't get a vote," Harlow growled, pushing the engines beyond safety parameters. The vortex appeared below them, still swirling with that ethereal blue light. But something was different. The pattern of its rotation had changed, spinning in multiple directions simultaneously, creating subvortices within the main structure. "It's destabilized," Dr. Vance warned. "The space-time tunnel has branched. It could lead anywhere." "Any place is better than here," Harlow decided, plunging them directly into the heart of the maelstrom. The same impossible forces gripped them, gravity fluctuating wildly, their bodies experiencing temporal displacement. Through the viewport, Dr. Sao glimpsed what looked like multiple versions of the abyss, each taking a different path through the vortex's branches. Then darkness again, and the violent sensation of reality reasserting itself. When consciousness returned, they were floating in calm waters. Daylight filtered through the viewports. The abyss's systems reported standard atmospheric pressure, normal gravity, and a depth of less than 100 meters. "We're back," Dr. Sao whispered, afraid to believe it. Dr. Vance checked her instruments. coordinates match our original launch position. It's as if we never left. Harlow initiated surface procedures and the abyss rose steadily through familiar-looking waters. Hope began to replace terror as they spotted a ship silhouetted against the horizon, a naval vessel matching the profile of the USS Oceanic. They established radio contact immediately. D.S.V Abyss to USS Oceanic, do you copy? This is Dr. Samuel Harlow. We have an emergency situation. 2 crew members lost, requesting immediate extraction. The response came quickly, but not in the voice of Admiral Phillips or any of their mission controllers. Instead, a confused young communications officer replied, "Unidentified vessel, this is USS Oceanic. Please identify yourself again and state your purpose in this restricted area." Cold dread settled in Harlow's stomach. This is the D.S.V Abyss returning from mission designation Mariana Deep 6. Authorization code Lima 79er Echo 3. A long pause followed before the radio crackled again. "Stand by, unidentified vessel." Minutes later, a new voice came through. Admiral Phillips. His tone a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Vessel claiming to be the Abyss, this is Admiral Phillips. Your authorization code is valid, but I'm afraid there's been some mistake. The D.S.V Abyss and its crew returned from the Mariana mission yesterday. They're currently aboard this ship, undergoing debriefing." The 3 surviving team members stared at each other in horror. "Request visual confirmation," Harlow managed to say through a suddenly dry throat. "Stand by for video transmission." The main screen activated, showing the bridge of the Oceanic. Admiral Phillips stood center frame, looking exactly as they remembered. But what caused Dr. Sow to scream was the group standing behind him. Themselves, or perfect duplicates. Dr. Samuel Harlow, Dr. Naomi Vance, Dr. Lin Cao, Captain Elias Mercer, and Mark Russo, all alive, all apparently unharmed, all staring at the camera with expressions of shock, matching their own. "Oh God," whispered Dr. Vance, "we didn't come back to our reality. We entered another branch." Harlow felt nauseated as he looked at his doppelganger on the screen. The other Harlow seemed to sense something wrong, stepping forward with narrowed eyes. "Admiral," the other Harlow said, "that's not us. Whatever came back in that vessel, it's not human." Dr. Sow grabbed Harlow's arm painfully. "The mirror," she hissed, pointing to the reflective surface of a darkened viewport. Their reflections were wrong. Subtly at first, then increasingly obvious as they stared. Their faces seemed to shift slightly, features misaligned by millimeters. Their movements didn't perfectly sync with their bodies. And their eyes were completely black, reflecting no light. The lights inside the abyss began to flicker. On the video screen, Admiral Phillips was barking orders, scrambling response teams. The other Harlow stared directly into the camera, his expression grim with understanding. "You brought it with you," he said softly, "didn't you?" In the abyss, the temperature plummeted. Their breath fogged in suddenly frigid air. Behind them, something moved in the shadows. Something that shouldn't exist in the confined space of the submersible. Dr. Tao was the first to see it clearly, turning with a gasp that condensed in the freezing air. The thing that had followed them, a fragment of the entity, hiding within their bodies, within the vessel itself, began to take form. It constructed itself from shadows and condensation, from fragments of light and pieces of darkness, building a shape that approximated humanity, but fundamentally failed to capture its essence. On the screen, the other Harlow's voice came through one final time, before the communication system died. "We'll find you. We'll stop what's coming. We'll..." Silence fell as all systems shut down. In the darkness, illuminated only by emergency chemical lights, they faced the truth. They hadn't escaped. They had merely become the perfect delivery system, bringing something back that was never meant to cross between worlds, something that would now spread across this new Earth like a cancer. As the entity fully manifested, growing to fill the compartment, Its surface rippled with familiar faces. Captain Mercer, Russo, and thousands of others they didn't recognize. Victims from countless iterations of countless timelines. The cycle continues, it said in their voices, reaching for them with appendages that defied physical laws. The harvest begins anew. Outside, the waters of the Mariana Trench remained calm, giving no indication of the horror that had emerged from its depths or the impossible worlds that waited below. The D.S.V abyss floated silently on the surface, appearing abandoned to the approaching rescue vessels, its hull untouched, its crew nowhere to be found. But in the depths below, something stirred, a vortex beginning to form where none had existed before, pulsing with ethereal blue light, waiting for the next expedition, the next team of explorers, seeking answers to questions better left unasked. The cycle continues, the harvest begins anew.